Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. With just days to go until the British Parliament votes again on Theresa May's Brexit deal, the political debate in the UK grows ever more polarised. But the legacy of Brexit won't just be deep fractures within the political parties. This protracted national argument has also raised questions about how the machinery of government works and the role of the supposedly apolitical civil service. My guest is Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, former top diplomat and UK National Security Advisor, now an ardent advocate of a second referendum. Have Britain's mandarins been exposed as an unelected, unaccountable brake on Brexit? Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
How hard did you have to think before you took the decision to enter the political fray on this vexed issue of Britain and Brexit? Because you had spent your entire working life being a, if I may say so, faceless, apolitical, mandarin, diplomat, civil servant. So you are doing something entirely new.
Well, first of all, I would regard myself as still apolitical. I'm not part of any political party.
That, if I may say so, is a very different thing. You can be political without being a member of a political party.
I'm not a party politician. I've also been given a place in the House of Lords, which was a great honour, and I assume I was put there because people thought it would be useful to have my experience in the public debate. And it's not just, of course, on issues of Brexit that I offer that opinion. But the country is facing such an important moment. I think probably the most serious peacetime crisis since the Second World War. And quite honestly, I think that opinions of those who've had years and years of public service but are no longer in the government, I think they're entitled to be in the debate. I personally make it a point of never attacking people. I don't want to get personal about these things, but I do have views about the policy, and I think the position the country is in makes it important that every view is heard. I'm no more legitimate than anybody else, but I think I'm no less.
Am I wrong in remembering that at one point you and a bunch of other senior diplomats described the current position and the negotiating strategy of the government as a fiasco?
I think that was a joint letter, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, I think we are in a serious mess.
Yes, but hang on, if you're accusing the Prime Minister and her team of conducting a fiasco of a negotiation, you are clearly making a very political point, and indeed a point that is deeply damaging to the serving Prime Minister.
Well, I am giving my opinion of the position that we're in, and I'm far from being alone in thinking that this negotiation that's been conducted has been pretty disastrous for the country. And started right at the beginning with the choices made about the red lines and the triggering of Article 50, and that we are now in a very difficult position. I spent a lot of my time abroad, and everybody says to me, what's happened to your country? You used to be a country of pragmatism, of common sense, of hard-headed sense of your own common national interest. Why have you spent the last 2 years in the way you have?
Right, but I just wonder how your successors as key members of the government team, that is the top civil servants running departments, whether it be the Brexit department, which we now have, whether it be the Cabinet Office and others, how they would view you on the sidelines as one of them in the very recent past, now sniping, describing the negotiating strategy as a fiasco, and using comments which not only are going to be picked up in the UK but picked up in Europe too, and clearly do something to undermine the Prime Minister's position.
Well, I don't think they undermine the Prime Minister's position. I think that people abroad are making up their own mind about the approach that she's taken. I mean, there's a long tradition of people who are no longer in government service speaking up on their own account, and indeed in this debate there are people who speak up on both sides of it. And there have been some very prominent figures speaking up very strongly for the Leave campaign, and indeed being very critical of those who speak up for Remain. But I think as an ex-public servant, I have my right to express my own view. I'm always careful not to attack politicians, and also to say that I think that those who are still in harness as public servants are doing the very best job they can in the usual professional way you'd expect of the civil service. But it's the leadership they've had from the politicians that I think justifies criticism, and I believe I'm legitimate in making that criticism.
The comments I've seen of yours, and you've written joint letters with others, and it must be said that the preponderance of senior civil servants who've entered this debate appear to be either ardent Remainers still, or certainly advocates of a second referendum. But let's park that for a moment. But in the way you've made your arguments, it seems to me the one thing you never refer to, you refer a lot to what you regard as a failing negotiating strategy and a process, but you never refer back to the fact that in June 2016 the British people gave a clear directive to the British government. That is 52% to 48%. They declared that they wanted Britain to leave the European Union.
And we've spent 2 years finding how difficult that is, what the cost to the UK is going to be, the fact that the country is going to be worse off, and in my view probably less secure as a result of leaving the EU. And I thought in a democracy that you had a regular consultation of the electorate, and that people were able to change their mind
as they learned the facts. That's parliamentary democracy. It's not this referendum, direct democracy, where, as your former boss, David Cameron, made very plain when he set upon this policy of a referendum, he said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime decision. Do not think there is going to be a second chance. He was quite explicit about it. He told the British people, this is your one-time opportunity to decide whether you want Britain to be in the European Union or not.
Well, that's what David Cameron said, but I think since the whole campaign was based on a series of propositions that have turned out to be just flat wrong, and that some of the issues, like Northern Ireland, barely figured at all in the campaign, given that this is such a moment of rupture in Britain's relations with the rest of the world, that I think it's not unreasonable at all that people should be presented with the deal and offered the chance to give their opinion. And if their opinion is, in the light of this deal, we still want to go ahead, then I'm certainly not going to oppose that. I
mean, if I may say so, much of what you say and much of your view about the, as you would put it, the deceptions and lies that were told during the original 2016 campaign, it is subjective. I mean, it's your view. It's not provable. It's not scientific. You just feel that deceptions were made upon the British people. But they, on the other side of this argument, the Brexiteer side of the argument, would say that you right now and your fellows, in some of the most renowned sort of experts in the country, so-called, are peddling misconceptions, even deceptions, about the downsides of leaving the European Union.
Well, maybe they do say that, but if you look at what
they certainly do.
Businesses are doing, people with a lot of money invested and a lot of money at stake in the UK, they are making decisions which suggest that they are very worried about the uncertainties created by Brexit.
Well, some are making decisions which are not welcome in the UK, taking money out. Others are putting whole lots of new money in.
Yeah. Well, again, we will see, but I note a lot of major investors in the UK are now deciding to move their business outside, to move jobs to other European capitals. And so they clearly think that there is something difficult about Brexit.
Yes, but that's what I'm really trying to get to. It's all subjective. You see all the downsides. Many other people see sunny uplands, and they're not just ideologues of the Brexit right. They're economists like Liam Halligan. He says right now the public finances are on the mend despite all the Brexit uncertainty. There's a healthy surplus. Employment's at record levels. In fact, if you look at UK growth, it's outstripping France and Germany right now. He says investors from China to the Middle East are flocking to this country. Forbes magazine's just declared Britain the best place in the world to do business. These are all realities that you choose to ignore.
I am not claiming that I have absolute truth on this. Everybody's view on this is subjective. We will see. We haven't left the EU yet, of course. We are beginning to see some of the effects of businesses deciding that they will move their business outside. Yes, for the moment, unemployment is high. Growth is not spectacular, but it is not disastrous. That's great. We haven't left the EU yet. and we still don't know what the future will be. I am simply offering my perspective on the basis of my experience and what I see and hear
Lord
from
Ricketts,
abroad, and I've never claimed to be speaking, absolute truth rather than subjective.
I'm trying to be quite forensic about the nature of your argument, though, because you say that categorically there has to be, and it is indeed legitimate to argue for a second referendum, because you say it is now quite clear how damaging a Brexit would be. And there are, of course, different forms of Brexit, but you seem to think any form of Brexit would be deeply damaging, and that's your justification for a second referendum. My point to you is that your conclusion about the negativity of Brexit is so subjective that it surely can't undo David Cameron's promise that this would be a once-in-a-lifetime decision.
But are you saying that my view is so subjective that I shouldn't make it available to people to consider?
No, I'm just saying it may lack credibility.
Well, yeah, maybe it does, but it's what I believe. It's what I believe people need to be aware of. I believe that the Brexit deal on offer in the Prime Minister's negotiated deal is certainly better than leaving with no deal at all, but is sufficiently damaging to Britain's future prospects that it is worth giving people a chance to confirm or otherwise the view they took on the basis of, frankly, a very skimpy campaign in 2016.
Let me, if I may, tap into your expertise and experience in one other key area of this Brexit argument. We've talked a little bit about the economy and the divergent views there are about what Brexit will mean for the economy, but you've also zeroed in on national security, and you bring to this a lot of experience because you were indeed David Cameron's national security advisor for a couple of years in his premiership. You and others, including John Sawyers, former head of MI6, have contended that the Brexit will do real, lasting, serious damage to Britain's national security and its sort of geopolitical standing in the wider world. Explain that to me.
Well, let's start with Britain's law and order, the cooperation that goes on between our police forces and those on the continent, our judicial authorities and those on the continent. I sit on a House of Lords committee which has looked at that and which has put out a report saying that we believe there are real risks for our security of leaving the EU without tying down a continuation of the cooperation that goes on under the EU instruments. At the moment, our police forces depend on databases, on confidential messaging systems, on a whole range of instruments to cooperate across borders with their European counterparts. We can only be part of those as a member of the EU. When we leave, we'll have to negotiate some sort of associate status.
Exactly.
And
we'll have to negotiate another status, another association, and given the import that everybody in Europe puts upon cooperation with Britain because of its very impressive record in a whole raft of different security agencies, there is almost no likelihood at all that Europe won't want very close security cooperation with the United Kingdom.
Well, what they say is that there are rules about who can be part of these EU instruments, and when you're a third country outside, you have to negotiate an associate status, which will give you less good access. And in some areas, like the European arrest warrant, some countries won't be willing to extradite their citizens to the UK at all. In others, there are EU instruments, but no country outside the EU is even an associate. So it's a complex field. It's going to take years of negotiation. And if we go ahead and leave before that's tied down, our law enforcement authorities will find it less easy to work. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner herself has said the same thing, so I'm far from being alone here. I think it's worth highlighting this.
Yeah, no question you're not alone, but it comes back to this same thing about subjectivity and whether you bring a glass half full or a glass half empty approach to Brexit. Let me quote to you a couple of senior security figures who do not take the same view as you. Jeremy Fleming, GCHQ Director, in 2018, at a NATO conference, he said, "We are leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe. We have excellent relationships with intelligence and security agencies right across this continent. We expect them to continue." Richard Dearlove, a former head of MI6, very sanguine about Britain's ability to develop strong relationships with the Europeans after Brexit. So again, it's a pick and mix. You can hear what you want to hear on both sides of this debate.
No, well, let's unpack that. Jeremy Fleming is talking about intelligence relationships, and I completely agree with him. Intelligence relationships happen outside the EU now. They will go on happening outside the EU afterwards. So they are not a part of this argument. Law enforcement judicial cooperation, foreign policy cooperation, defence cooperation go through the EU and will be affected.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but if I may say so, it seems to me the biggest British foreign policy, security, military decision of the past 20 years, the one of most significance, was the decision to join the Americans in the invasion of Iraq, toppling Saddam Hussein. Now, when that happened, the EU was adamantly opposed to that policy. It was Britain, the United States, a few other EU member states like Spain and Poland who supported that. But the EU as a whole, led by Jacques Chirac of France, was absolutely opposed to it. So when it comes to those key elements of Britain's national security policy, it's not the EU that matters most. It's our relationship with the United States and it's NATO.
Well, the EU was absolutely split down the middle. It wasn't opposed, it was split on Iraq, with some countries taking one position, other countries
the Franco-German motor, which is still at the centre of the European Union, thought that our decision to go into Iraq was mad.
Correct, yeah. And then a lot of people would agree with them that was a good judgment.
So when you tell me that, if we leave the EU, our security, our military, our defence capabilities will be fatally undermined, it seems to me categorically to fly in the face of history and the evidence.
But I haven't said our defence capabilities will be undermined. I've said in a very clear way the internal security issues of law and order and judicial cooperation will be affected. They won't stop altogether, but the police will find it harder, slower, to take more resources to achieve the cooperation that we have now. On intelligence, it won't be affected. On defence, much less, because defence, EU has a defence capacity, but it's a very modest one. The main load goes through NATO and in our bilateral relationship with America.
Indeed.
And I've never argued otherwise.
And isn't the truth, and you would know this much better than me as a former ambassador to France, that even the French still want very strong defence and military cooperation with Britain, whatever happens about Brexit?
They do, although if you notice now on the defence industrial side, where we had very close cooperation with the French, for example, between BAE and Dassault over future aircraft and drones. Now suddenly all that is orienting towards France and Germany. So on the industrial side, it's more difficult. But just to finish on that point, I think Britain's weight in the world will be less as a result of leaving the EU. Because instead of being an influential member of one of the largest blocs in the world, able to steer policies, we'll be on the outside of it. And for Washington, we will be less useful as an ally because we will have cast anchor from the EU.
Well, frankly, that's not the way Donald Trump sees it. I mean, he just happens to be president of the United States. He thinks Britain leaving the EU is a jolly good thing.
Yeah, well, he has a view as well.
You tell me blithely that it's going to damage our relationships with Washington, and the president of the United States is cheering us on if we leave the European Union. He thinks it's terrific for Britain and for transatlantic relations.
Well, I leave Donald Trump's view to himself. I take a view that we will be a less influential international player. We'll have to work harder to have influence in the world outside the EU.
There's a couple of other things I want to get to before we finish the interview. We don't have much time, but one last thought on Brexit. Does it worry you that the Foreign Office in particular, which was your home for so long, seems to be peopled by mandarins who all think Brexit is not in Britain's interest, is wrong-headed, misguided, and shouldn't happen? It seems to me there is a groupthink, there is a bubble in the senior civil service, but particularly in the Foreign Office, which is not representative of the country as a whole. And surely, again, in governance terms, that is problematic.
Why do you think that?
Why do I think that there is this preponderance of one view? Well, because people like Sir Simon Fraser, who succeeded you as boss of the FCO in civil service terms, he says it's no secret that most people in the British foreign policy establishment favoured staying in the European Union.
Well, favoured, but now, if you're in the civil service, the reason for my question to you is because if you're in the civil service, I have complete confidence that they will be doing a professional job to deliver the instructions of ministers. I would have done, if I'd been a civil servant, Simon Fraser would have done, John Sawyers would have done.
And Ollie Robbins, who of course is a senior civil servant, who's been in charge of much of the negotiation with Michel Barnier in Brussels on behalf of the British government, is seen by those who support Brexit, i.e. politicians as opposed to civil servants, as being a man who brought his own beliefs and commitments and thoughts about Brexit to the table in a way that was deleterious to the negotiation from Britain's point of view.
Well, I mean, I think that's disgraceful to attack a civil servant who is in office like that. I mean, nobody knows what Ollie's personal views are. Oliver Robbins has carried an enormous load.
Ollie Robbins has got Europe running through his veins. That's the quote from one Brexiteer.
Well, yeah, sure. But Oliver Robbins is a very serious professional civil servant who's been given an almost impossible task by the red lines the Prime Minister set him, who's struggled manfully over the last 2 years, and I think it's quite wrong for him to be attacked personally. I have complete confidence that those who are in harness in the civil service will be doing what ministers tell them to do, and in the very best way they can.
2 quick points before we finish. One of them very germane to what happens to civil servants when they leave their post. You left the civil service. You are now a senior consultant advisor to Lockheed Martin, the US defense and arms manufacturer, whose weapons are used by the Saudi government in their campaign in Yemen. Does it trouble you that, again, with your experience, your place in the House of Lords, the respect afforded to you as a former apolitical civil servant, that you now work for an organisation, a defence huge corporation, which is involved in helping the Saudis bomb Yemen?
Well, I have nothing to do with Lockheed Martin's arrangements with Saudi Arabia. I advise Lockheed Martin's UK office.
Well, hang on a minute, but it's a global corporation. You can hardly disassociate yourself from what Lockheed Martin's parent in America does.
If I can just finish my point. I am not a spokesman for Lockheed Martin. I'm an advisor to them in their relations with the British government. That was cleared through the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. It's a role which I can play between a major US corporate and the British government on some issues of pretty fundamental importance to the UK, like our future strike fighter and other things that Lockheed Martin do.
And just one thought on that, when you work for a company which is so locked into a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and then you see the murder of an independent journalist in, as it was, Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate in Istanbul, does it give you pause about your own company's relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's not my company. I am an advisor to Lockheed Martin UK.
You take a fee from them every year, and I wonder if it gives you pause.
Yeah, I take a fee to help them with their relations with the British government in an arrangement which is completely open and above board. And so what goes on in Saudi Arabia is not something I'm involved in at all, either with Lockheed Martin or in any other capacity.
Do you have a view on it?
I mean, I have a view that Saudi Arabia has more to do to account for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
And should governments and corporations therefore exercise their ability to put influence and leverage on the Saudis by either imposing sanctions or indeed withdrawing commercial contracts?
Well, governments have been doing that, and the British government and Jeremy Hunt, and I give him credit for this, has been active on that. I make no comment on Lockheed Martin's policy. It's not my position to do so.
And a final area that I would like your view on, that is the vexed issue of what to do about British citizens who went off to Syria, sometimes Iraq as well, to fight for jihadists of so-called Islamic State. The germane issue right now is the young woman Shumaima Begum, who has been found in a camp in Syria. She's a British citizen. I should say she was a British citizen, but the Home Secretary has declared he's going to strip her of that citizenship because she went off to Syria to support and do what she could for the jihadists. Do you think, as a former national security advisor to David Cameron, that was the right thing to do?
Well, I have big questions about it, because I think for all these people, this young lady but others as well, were born here, brought up here, educated here, radicalized here. And therefore we have some moral responsibility and some practical responsibility to bring them home, to have them face justice here if they're not in a country where they can face justice in acceptable conditions. And I think to strip people like that of their British nationality when they don't have another nationality, I think the argument is she's entitled to Bangladeshi nationality, but she's got no contact with Bangladesh at all. Seems to me that our obligation is to have these people back to the UK, to try them if there's evidence that they've committed crimes, and then to work to reintegrate them. And it may be that among these people will be some who will be sufficiently horrified with what they've seen that they can then help in the campaign to prevent other teenagers being seduced by Islamist propaganda and going abroad. But
was it opportunism on the part of the UK Home Secretary to declare that she was no longer a British citizen?
Well, I personally think it was the wrong decision, that we ought to accept she's a British citizen and have her back to this country.
Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, thank you very much for being on HARDtalk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.